Yo, what's going on YouTube? Grind back here with another one, and I know, I seem to have dropped off the face of the earth, but let's be real. We all need a break sometimes, and there for a while, D4 was definitely getting quite boring, and there wasn't any real transformative content that was being released. But now that Season 6 is just around the corner, and Vessel of Hatred is not only bringing a new class, but a variety of additional content to the game, I feel it's appropriate to not only make my return to Diablo 4 as a whole, but also to making guides specifically for the Spiritborn class itself. If you couldn't infer it already whilst clicking on the video, this build is centered around the primary skill Razor Wings. As you can tell by this wonderful skill mechanic display captured by Woodiju, this skill not only has the ability to AoE clear the entire screen, but also packs a hefty punch when combined with some other pretty heavy multiplicative factors. The reason why I'm releasing this build guide as my first is because I genuinely feel like it's probably going to be my best for not only leveling, but also the most enjoyable for in-game pushing and overall content clearing. In a lot of ways, the mechanics of this build have brought me back to and remind me of the old school rogue that we used to run in Season 1 and 2. But before diving straight into the build, I want to start off by preceding the video with a short description as to how the Spiritborn class's mechanics fundamentally function. The Spiritborn has 4 types of spirit animals, each with their own respective skills. The Jaguar incorporates and excels at fire damage and fast-paced multi-attacks. The Eagle channels lightning damage and hones in on mobility and benefiting from its enhancements. The Gorilla comes swinging heavy physical damage with high investments in damage reduction and other forms of mitigation. The Centipede harbors a deadly bite utilizing a toxic poison which pairs perfectly with a myriad of debuffs. In addition to each spirit having its own respective skills, they also grant specific class bonuses, each applying a specific passive effect to aid you in your progression, similar to the Druid spirit boons. The Spiritborn can select 2 of these bonuses at will with no restrictions on mixing and matching. Outside of personal preference or potential build synergies, your primary bonus is unlocked at level 15, and later on, at level 30, your secondary slot is unlocked for you to socket your final spirit bonus. The Spiritborn's main resource is called Vigor. In addition to Vigor, the Spiritborn introduces 2 new proc effects, the first being Ferocity, which increases your attack speed by 5% per stack, up to 4 times each stack, lasting 4 seconds, and the second being Resolve, which increases your damage reduction by 20% while at least 1 stack is active. Taking direct damage will consume a stack of Resolve, and the base amount of stacks is set to 8, but as we will see later on, you can increase this amount as well as synergize off of it to create a pretty interesting build combination. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into the guide. Diving right in and taking a look at our skills here, we're going to reference our planner. We're going to go ahead and take for a basic Rock Splinter. Now Rock Splinter is going to do a couple things for us. First of all, obviously it's going to generate Vigor, which is our primary resource. Additionally, as you can see here, due to the enhanced Rock Splinter spec, it's going to allow us to increase our block chance by a slight amount and additionally gain Vigor whenever we block. Block chance is primarily important to us due to the scaling of our crit damage through a series of aspect synergies that we'll reference later on when we go ahead and take a look at our gear. Most importantly, if we take a look at our enhanced form of Rock Splinter, we're going to go ahead and take Sharp Rock Splinter. Now this is due to the fact that we need a Resolve generator for our build. Initially, directly, Resolve gives us an increased damage reduction value of 20%, and whenever we take direct damage, we're going to go ahead and consume a stack of Resolve. Initially, we can go ahead and baseline stack up to 8 stacks of Resolve, and then later on, once we reference our gear, we're going to go ahead and see that each stack of Resolve is going to give us 15% block chance, and as we drew reference to just a second ago, through a series of aspect synergies, our block chance is going to actually multiplicatively scale our crit damage overall. Now, since this is a primarily Razor Wing focused build, we aren't going to be picking up any core skills themselves. However, to unlock our pathing to the rest of our skill tree, we are going to be picking up the follow through passive node, which is going to give us 15% increased damage to our basic skills, which is then doubled for our third skill cast. Optionally, you could go ahead and opt for the Vigorous and Velocity nodes, which you'd only want to put 1 in Vigorous and 2 in Velocity, as you once again don't actually have a core skill, so you're not going to gain any benefit from Vigorous. However, Velocity would give you the benefit of 2 vigor each second while moving, as long as you have dealt damage within the last 5 seconds, which could be something beneficial early on for generating vigor. However, I don't necessarily think it's something that is immediately required. Jumping down and taking a look at our focus skills, once again we aren't going to pick up much here. Instead, we're going to just opt to pick a few passives, those being Mirage, which is going to give us 50% increased dodge chance when we evade, as well as a 15% increased critical strike chance for 3 seconds whenever we go ahead and dodge. Looking just above that, we have Unrestrained, which is going to give us 12% multiplicative increased damage while either unhindered or unstoppable. There are a few different ways to become either unhindered or unstoppable, some of which we'll discuss later. However, the main takeaway from this passive is that we are getting 12% multiplicative increased damage, which is permanently upkept. Moving on to our defensive skills, there's a lot going on here, but the main thing I want to start off by talking about is Armored Hide. This is going to do a few things for us. First of all, passively, it's going to generate a little bit of resolve, but the most important part here is the active benefit, which is going to go ahead and encase us, making us unstoppable and granting us 100% additive block chance. Now, if you can't sort of already see it all coming together, this is once again part of what I talked about before. We need block chance to increase our critical strike damage through a synergy of aspects, and this is just one step along the way in order to grant the maximum potential benefit to that synergy. We're going to be getting a 100% additive block chance benefit from this one skill alone as long as it's upkept, and as you'll see later, we have a few different variables that allow us to reset our cooldown, so I don't really see any sort of issues in regards to cooldowns for this specific skill or any others, so upkeep should be pretty good. Jumping up to take a look at our enhanced armor hide, we are going to be picking this up in order to gain the benefit of maximum resolve whenever armor hide is active. It does give an additional benefit of thorns multiplication, however we don't really want that. Just let it be noted that this is a good way to kind of theory craft and put together a thorns build. Gorilla has a lot of thorns synergies, so keep that in mind if you're interested in something like that. However, for us, we don't really have any interest in thorns, and it doesn't incorporate the overall synergies of our build, so we won't be going for that. But maximum resolve does allow us to gain that full benefit on block chance like we talked about earlier. Each stack of resolve will grant us 15 block chance, which will hence increase our critical strike damage multiplicatively. Additionally, you could pick up reinforced armor hide, which would give you a increase on your block chance by 5% for every nearby enemy, up to 20%. However, I don't necessarily feel like this is necessary defensive wise. However, if you do find yourself lacking in your defenses, I would definitely recommend this as a pickup, as it is simply 1 point away. In addition, you can pick up the adaptable armor hide spec. This does allow you to deal 100% of your thorns to enemies when you evade through them. However, the specific thing that you're looking for here is that healing for 5% of your maximum life per hit when you do evade through those enemies. This would just give you a little bit of additional healing. However, in my personal opinion, once again, I don't feel that it is necessary. Now jumping over and taking a look at some of the passives we have here, the first one's going to be Endurance. This is going to give us 5 Vigor whenever we cast the defensive skill. This is just a pathway to get to the other two, as it really isn't that important. Gaining Vigor this early on and even in the late game just doesn't seem like it's a problem, so we're going to go ahead and skip by that one. Taking a look at Perseverance, this is going to give us that additional damage reduction that we talked about before whenever we have a stack of resolve. So this is just a little bit of extra defenses. If you don't find yourself lacking in your defenses, you could by all means drop this. However, since we are so invested into resolve, I find that this is a good pickup. It's just going to give us an absurd amount of damage reduction, as you'll see later on, due to the fact that our resolve stacks get a lot higher than that initial 8 base. But moving on here to Fueled, this grants us increased life on kill equal to 15% of our max life, while we have at least 4 stacks of ferocity. We don't have any skill-based ferocity generators. However, as you'll see later on with the Spirit Hall, that isn't really a problem. We take care of that with a Jaguar skill, or rather a Jaguar Spirit spec within the Spirit Hall itself. Not exactly sure what to call that yet, but I digress. Dropping down and taking a look at our final passive here, we have Patient Guard, which is going to give us 10% block chance, and then after standing still for 0.5 seconds, we're going to gain 3% block damage reduction until we next move. And we aren't really looking for that, but rather the initial 10% increased block chance. You could drop this off if you didn't need it. However, that 10% is going to go into our overall multiplicative crit pool, so every little bit counts. That's why we pick this up. Wrapping around the left and going ahead and taking a look at counterattack here, this is going to be the final thing on our defensive tree. I did save it for last, as it does give us a myriad of different effects, so let's cover those one by one so we don't miss any. Passively, that's going to give us 10% dodge chance and will automatically retaliate against close enemies for 80% damage when you dodge their attacks. While it's active, we're going to gain the ability to dodge all direct attacks for 3 seconds per cast, up to 6 seconds. And then in addition to these, we are primarily picking this up as it does give us the ability to reflect our Razor Wings back out again, which is essentially a second cast on top of the second cast that you'll see we'll be getting from our two-handed weapon. But in addition to this, we're going to go ahead and move on to the enhanced form so we can see what else it gives us. Taking a look at counterattack enhancement, we are going to get the ability to reduce counterattack's cooldown by 0.5 seconds per stack of ferocity we have. This is pretty good. However, like I said before, we have various other factors to reduce cooldown, so on top of those, this just pretty much probably will give us the ability to permanently upkeep counterattack. In addition to that, we have the ability to gain counterattack charges as a temper, so I don't think that we're going to struggle with charges, cooldowns of any sort for this build, really, nor in general for the Spiritborn class overall. Dropping down, this is primarily what I wanted to talk about, reinforced counterattack. This is going to actually allow us to passively increase our critical strike damage by 6% for every close enemy, up to 30%. I like to put this on kind of all of my builds that are at least critical or physical based, simply due to the fact that it is a passive effect. You don't even have to use counterattack. Luckily, this build does use counterattack, so it's kind of a double benefit in a way, but in general, the critical strike damage alone being boosted by 30% multiplicatively, I feel is worth 3 points within my skill tree, especially due to the fact that we've gained between, I believe, 10 to 15 extra skill points with the Vessel of Hatred expansion itself. So I don't think that we're going to have any problems with skill points or attributing what we want. Advancing on to our potency skills, this is where we have our most important skill and what the build is centralized around, Razor Wings. Now, as you may have seen in other gameplay or at the beginning of the video, Razor Wings is a spiraling projectile that either goes straight out from where you cast it or in a circular pattern rebounding back towards you. And with enough casts or a low enough cooldown, you can create what is essentially a whirlwind or tornado of razor blades around you that just shreds all enemies even daring to come close to you. This wipes almost the entire screen and even goes through walls from what we've seen. They might change that mechanic, but that is to be determined once we get in game, I suppose. Looking at our enhanced form of Razor Wings, this is going to allow us to proc vulnerable on enemies for 5 seconds whenever we hit them with a critical striker from behind, and due to the nature of the spiral pattern of the blades themselves, this should be pretty much always, but if that's not the case, then due to the fact that we are a critical strike build and have high critical strike attribution, then this shouldn't be a problem at all. Jumping up to invasive Razor Wings, this grants us 300% duration on our wings, and most importantly grants us the spiraling effect that we're looking for in order to gain that whirlwind, or rather tornado, of razors that just clears everything in our path. The alternative is poised Razor Wings. This is going to give us a 10% chance to regain a charge. However, we know that our cooldowns are going to be able to be reduced pretty well. In addition to this, we have the ability to temper additional Razor Wing charges, so we don't really need to be concerned with cooldowns nor charge casts for Razor Wings. In my opinion, this is not necessarily as beneficial as having them spiral outwards, so we won't be choosing this. I digress. Taking a look at our first passive here, we have Brilliance. This is going to multiplicatively increase our Eagle skill damage based on the amount of movement speed that we have. As you can see right now, we are going to be getting a 40% increase based on the amount of movement speed that you have. In addition to this, we are going to be able to gain movement speed in other sources, one of which being the inclusion of an aspect. But moving on, with acceleration, we're going to be able to gain 15% increased movement speed for 4 seconds whenever we cast an Eagle skill, and obviously due to the fact that our main skill is an Eagle skill, we should be able to upkeep this pretty much all the time, which again is another source of that movement speed, which we need to increase the damage with our Brilliance passive. So starting off strong here on the movement speed, moving up to Resilient. Whenever we cast a Gorilla skill, we're going to gain 15% multiplicative increase max life. Once again, just a little bit of extra defensive addition here. I'm not totally sure if we're going to need this, and actually in the unique version of my planner, I do remove this. However, for early game and for leveling, I feel like having that additional max life is probably going to be pretty helpful. But once you get your Paragon and you can substitute some of the max life out with some nodes per se, then you might not need this and you could save the points for some additional ranks, an extra skill, or potentially extra damage through passive ranks. Taking a look at our next potency skill here, we have Rushing Claw. There's not too much to go into on this one. This is our form of the dash. It does have 4 charges instead of the 2 that a rogue would have, but for this specific build, we are going to be using this as our main mobility skill. But moving on, when looking at Enhanced Rushing Claw, we can see that this allows us to deal 80% additive damage with Rushing Claw to enemies that have been hit by Rushing Claw. Not too important for our uses, so moving on to the next one, which is more important in our case, Invasive Rushing Claw. This is actually going to essentially allow us to reset our charges of said dash, and that's by consuming 4 stacks of ferocity. Like I mentioned before, we don't have a direct skill generator for ferocity, but using our Spirit Hall, we are able to adequately generate ferocity with absolutely no problems. However, this effect can only trigger once every 20 seconds, so don't expect to be spamming Rushing Claw through the dungeons or anything, but for the circumstances we'll be using it in, it will be very useful. Once again, alternatively, we could be picking up Poised Rushing Claw here, but that 10% increased dodge chance isn't really useful in our circumstances. I do want to go ahead and take the time here to note that this is really just personal preference here. As you can see, Rushing Claw doesn't have any sort of benefit in the multiplicative way that we scale our damage or anything like that. I just kind of figured that this specific skill would pair with the build a little bit better than, say, Soar would, as I usually prefer to use Soar to proc vulnerable and certain effects like that, and without the ability to use the unique boots that are associated with Soar that allow you to use Soar as your evade, I just didn't feel it appropriate to favor Soar over Rushing Claw for this specific build. Taking a look at our first Jaguar passive here though, this is going to allow us to stack 0.1% multiplicative damage up to 10% multiplicative damage per rank, and I don't really have to explain why this is good. It's just unconditional multiplicative damage, so I feel it fit to go ahead and invest your full amount of ranks in this, and as you can see, potentially even get some of those ranks on your amulet as well. You might be wondering why I'm getting a Jaguar passive while I'm using an Eagle skill for my primary, but as we discussed before, our Spirit Hall benefits allow us to actually apply different spirit effects to skills that would otherwise be an individualized spirit. Henceforth, I'm able to make my Eagle skill a Jaguar skill by making my primary spirit bonus a Jaguar. Dropping down and taking a look at our final Jaguar passive, Furnace here, this is going to allow us to gain 1% multiplicative increased critical strike damage per stack of ferocity that we have. And this is pretty important because as we stack our ferocity up, this is going to grant us a pretty exponential increase for our critical strike damage, especially when coupled with our other multiplicative factors. Finally, for our last section in the skill tree, we have our ultimate section, and obviously we're going to go ahead and pick up the hunter here. However, in a lot of ways this is going to be personal preference. I'm just going with the hunter because I feel it personally fits the build as well as my personal playstyle, being more of a melee, close range, action based player. I'm very aggressive and I do like the melee close range playstyle. I'm not really a ranged player coming from Rogue. You can look at a lot of my builds and maybe some of you guys know me. I'm definitely not a ranged player and I prefer more tanky, aggressive, dominating builds. Moving on from that divergence though, we can go ahead and take a look at the hunter here and see that the way in which it essentially works is it leaps on the field and performs a aerial attack striking for 7 times, and this 7 times is in a circular pattern which creates a whirlwinding effect around you that AoEs enemies, overall aiding your damage. Dropping down, Harmonious Hunter is going to allow us to overfill our ferocity by 4 stacks and will allow us to gain 100% multiplicative increased damage to injured enemies. Apart from the overall multiplicative damage, this is going to overfill our ferocity, which in turn is going to give us more critical strike damage through the aid of the Furnace passive that we talked about earlier. Next up is Exalted Hunter. This reads, killing an enemy while the hunter is present has a 40% chance to instantly reset its cooldown. This chance is halved after each consecutive reset. This is a really good way for us to reset the cooldown of our ultimate skill, and here in a second we're going to see that our key passive actually aids this benefit in order to pretty much keep a 100% uptime on our ultimate skill itself. We're going to go ahead and wrap up and finalize our ultimate skill tree section here by ending off with the passives. First of which is going to be Resolution, which allows us to gain an additional 15% multiplicative increased damage to elites for 3 seconds whenever we cast an ultimate skill, which is then doubled if we're only fighting one enemy. This is a good way to get a little bit of additional multiplicative damage and considering the fact that elite damage is one of the fewest seen multipliers, I'll definitely take this. Next up, we have Spiritual Attunement. This is going to give us an additional 10% maximum vigor whenever we have an ultimate skill equipped. This isn't too important. We're going to kind of glance over it as it's just a pathway to get to our next node. That being Supremacy. Supremacy reads, any enemies you kill while an ultimate skill is active grants a stack of Supremacy, each increasing your damage by 3% multiplicatively up to 30% multiplicatively. When an ultimate skill ends, you gain 5 stacks of Supremacy, but you begin to lose 1 stack every second. This is another good source of multiplicative damage, and due to the fact that we're kind of always going to be trying to at least upkeep our ultimate, we should be granting a permanent 30% multiplicative damage bonus to all of our damage. Dropping down to what might be arguably the most important passive for this build, we have Intricacy. Upon casting an ultimate skill, the last potency, defensive, or focus skill you cast prior is reset and can be cast for free up to 3 times in the next 5 seconds. What this does is allow us to essentially cast our Razor Wings 3 free times after we cast the Hunter. Now, if we can spam the Hunter, that means we can permanently cast our Razor Wings for free. But that might not always be the case, and due to the fact that this says potency or focus and including defensive skills, we could potentially reset one of our other skills and accidentally gain free casts for them. However, that's not necessarily a problem for me, but we obviously have to have a path to Intricacy. So moving on and taking a look to the right, we have Sustenance, which is going to allow us to gain 2% maximum life whenever we hit an enemy with our ultimate skill. Not too important because we do have other sources of healing. However, I'm not going to complain about gaining more overall quote-unquote defense for this build. Now that we've covered everything that's prerequisite to our key passive, let's go ahead and take a look at it. We have various options here, and don't get me wrong, they all are good in their own rights, but for this specific build, we're going to go ahead and choose Prodigy's Tempo. Every 3rd consecutive cast of the same basic skill is going to increase all purchase ranks by 2. Primarily what we're going to be looking at is every 3rd consecutive cast of the same core potency skill reduces all skills active cooldowns by 10%, increased by 2% for each of their skills ranks. So this is how we're going to be reducing all of our cooldowns like I mentioned before, and due to the fact that Razor Wings is a potency skill, we're going to be allowed to essentially reset all of our cooldowns all the time by just spamming our quote-unquote core skill. That is going to go ahead and wrap it up for our skill tree section of this video, guys. If you needed to pause or rewind for any section, go ahead and feel free. And with that being said, with no further ado, let's go ahead and get right on in to the gear section of this build guide. We're going to start right off here with our two-hander. We're going to be running the aspect of Potent Exchange. This is going to allow us to gain 1 resolve whenever we dodge an attack, but most importantly and primarily, we're going to be gaining the ability to consume 2 resolve stacks in order to gain 110% multiplicative increased damage on our potency skill attacks. Now what this means is we're going to be able to spend 2 resolve to increase the damage of our Razor Wings by 110% multiplicatively. As long as we have the resolve, that is. And due to the fact that once again we have that basic as a resolve generator, this shouldn't be a problem. Taking a quick glance at the affixes really quick, most importantly we're going to get chance for Razor Wings projectiles to cast twice. This is going to essentially be a 2x multiplicative factor on our damage, so absolutely do not forget about this one here. Additionally, we are going to get crit strike damage on 2 fronts. As you've seen, we are getting multiple crit strike damage multiplicative factors to aid this base stat. So this is the primary stat that we are going to be attributing and investing into. Side note, if you notice there at the bottom, we are using the Yule combo here on our two-hander in order to gain our Barbarian's Warcry. This is a massive benefit to our damage, so it is the main rune combo that we are going to be using on this build. There are other combos, however this is the specific one that I chose to put together considering we aren't using a core skill. Jumping up and taking a look at our boots here, we are going to be running the aspect of Fleet Wings. This is going to allow our Razor Wings to also be an incarnate skill. This isn't too important. We do have one synergy with an offensive aspect with this. However, it isn't granting us any sort of massive benefit, nor one that we necessarily need. The most important part here is that this is going to give us passive unhindrance, which if we remember the unrestrained passive node, that does give us a 12% multiplicative increase to our damage whenever we are unstoppable or unhindered. Therefore, this will give us that permanent upkept bonus. Additionally, whenever we have our Razor Wings active, we are going to gain 35% additional increased movement speed per Razor Wing, which if we remember that Brilliance passive, this is going to massively scale that multiplicative increased damage to our Eagle skills based on our overall movement speed bonus. There's not a whole lot to break down here on the boots apart from the movement speed. Remember, as we were just talking about 2 seconds ago, we need as much movement speed as possible to scale our overall Eagle skill damage based on that Brilliance node. But apart from that, we are going to be picking up Dex as our main stat and a little bit of armor. Armor is important outside of its base defensive value, as we do have a multiplicatively scaled aspect that allows us to take our armor and then give ourselves base damage. This simulates gaining an additional weapon, having increased IP, or simply having a weapon with higher DPS. Advancing onto our pants here, we have the aspect of interdiction. As we mentioned countless times before, this is going to be the actual aspect that grants us block chance per stack of resolve. As I mentioned before, that's going to be at a value of 15% per stack, and this is actually pretty overpowered when it comes to synergizing with the pre-mentioned aspect, where you get a percentage multiplicative increase on your overall critical strike damage bucket per percentage block chance that you gain. When looking at the affixes selected, we can see that we are going to go ahead and pick up a little bit of resistance here. There aren't really other ways to get resistance on this build apart from direct affix specs on your gear, so we are going to pick up at least 1 or 2 of those. Below, we are going to pick up armor as well as our main stat Dex. We do pick up the lucky hit chance to CC effects, as there isn't really a better temperament for our secondary temper. But most importantly, looking at the below temper, we can see that we do get the ability to increase our maximum resolve stacks, which paired with the below aspect as well as aspects that have been mentioned previously, the overall synergies that we're starting to cook here are accumulating into some pretty heavy exponential increases on our overall damage as well as specifically crit damage. Going on to further this idea, we're going to take a look at the gloves where we have the duelist aspect. This increases our maximum ferocity by 5, and if we remember the furnace passive, this is going to actually allow us to gain even more critical strike damage, as we will be able to gain even more stacks of said ferocity. Looking at our affixes, these are pretty typical of a crit strike build, and especially a non-core build. We're going to be picking up that double dipping crit strike damage as well as crit strike chance and attack speed. Once again, we do pick up that lucky hit chance to proc that CC effect as just an additional temper so we can continue masterworking. When it comes to our chest, we have one of the more important aspects when it comes to our build. We have the aspect of deflection. This allows counterattack to reflect incoming Razor Wings back out again, as well as other small missiles and projectiles. We mentioned this before when talking about the skills a little bit. Not only does this allow us to reflect a projectile back out, but essentially is allowing us to gain a secondary cast on top of our secondary cast, which is a pretty heavy multiplicative damage factor. If these are already going to be all around the screen, when you pair this aspect in there, this is just going to bounce them back out again and chain them all around, which permanently upkeeps the entire effect. I don't really see any point in time where this drops off unless you purposely choose to stop attacking. When it comes to our affixes, we do have 2 important ones, potentially 3 here, debatably. We are going to start it off with a little bit of resistance to cap our resistance. As we know, our highest torment level is going to reduce our resistances by 100%, so you've definitely got to get a higher source of resistance and potentially multiple sources of resistances rather. So we definitely want to pick that up and potentially go ahead and invest in it a little bit more heavily than we normally would. Additionally, we have dexterity as it is our main stat, and just below that we have armored hide ranks, which is going to allow us to gain an increased duration on armor hide, which will allow us to not have to worry about that cooldown as much and maintain that upkeep on that 100% block chance that it grants more permanently. Obviously below that we have maximum resolve stacks, which is very important to increase our overall block chance and therefore crit strike damage. For our final armor piece here, we have our helmet with the aspect of disobedience. Primarily we are picking up the aspect of disobedience, not just because armor does give us a substantial benefit to survivability and defense, especially as we go through the torment tiers where we are going to be getting a significant reduction in armor. I believe once we reach torment tier 4 we are going to be getting a 1000 reduction on our armor total. But also due to the aspect that you're about to see on the amulet, we are able to multiplicatively scale our damage based on the amount of armor that we have. When it comes to our affixes, once again we have that same armor, dexterity. Most importantly, we have ranks to our Razor Wings, which is obviously our quote-unquote core skill, so we want to buff that as much as we possibly can. And then once again, our maximum resolve stacks. Jumping over to take a look at our jewelry here, we have our amulet, which is going to be rocking the unyielding hits aspect. This is going to allow our gorilla skills to go ahead and add 60% of our armor to all of our attacks for 3 seconds. So essentially what this does, like I mentioned previously, is give us an extra weapon, extra IP, or extra damage per second on our weapon. That's essentially the equivalence of what this aspect does. It adds that armor onto your DPS is kind of essentially what I'm understanding. If it does work that way and it ends up being a lot more overpowered than say some of our other aspects, we might rotate them around or potentially invest a little bit more in armor, say drop one of these passives for total armor percentage, or go back through and try to find a way to maybe drop maximum resolve stacks for total armor. However, based on the way that I'm kind of understanding the multiplicative factors to work, the way that we have set up currently is seemingly the best. However, I will reserve the right to go ahead and make different renditions and iterations of this and try to test and ultimately determine whether or not the choices that I've made are the most optimal and efficient. I by no means am stating that this is the meta, the best, or the most efficient for anyone's given circumstances. This is just the way that I've compiled the build. Additionally, taking a look at the affixes, we can see that we're going full in on passives. I don't necessarily expect everybody to be able to achieve even obtaining 2 of these. However, if you could get 1, 2, even 3 passives on the same amulet, that would be quite overpowered. I know that using the, I believe, Undercity, we are going to be able to farm certain amulets that have at least 1 passive rank on them, so it might be easier to find 2 or even 3 passive rank necklaces, so that's definitely something to look out for. I am going with Brilliance, Furnace, and Potent as they are the specific passives that I'm using. I would recommend potentially triple masterworking, double masterworking one of these. I'm not totally sure at the current point in theory crafting where I can say which one would be more advisable as opposed to the other one. However, based on the current point of your gameplay, I would recommend taking a look at which one's giving you the biggest benefit and then boosting that one up as high as you can. Below our passives, you can see we are opting for critical strike damage once again. I do want to note that It is possible that, say, Jaguar or Eagle damage could be a little bit more beneficial in this circumstance. However, critical strike damage is the overall higher bucket, and due to the fact that pretty much all of our multiplicative factors revolve around critical strike damage and enhancing the critical strike damage bucket in its entirety, I feel that it's appropriate to go ahead and invest fully in critical strike damage, as well as that obviously maximum resolve stacks. Dropping down to take a look at our rings here, we kind of have the same sort of thing going on between the two of them, but taking a look at the first one, we have the Fell Soothsayers aspect. This is going to allow us to proc vulnerable for 5 seconds whenever we cast an incarnate skill, and if you remember, the aspect on our boots allows our Razor Wings to become an incarnate skill, which means not only will Razor Wings innately proc vuln, but this will allow them to proc vuln in an AoE manner to enemies around you. Additionally, whenever we kill a vulnerable enemy, we henceforth echo 55% of the killing blow's base damage to another nearby enemy. This is just another additional way to get a little bit of extra damage. We could totally drop this aspect for another damage based aspect, or potentially say accelerating or something of that variety. However, we haven't totally experimented with things like that yet, so I'm not totally sure what's best to recommend. However, I will openly say that this is kind of a filler slot if you feel it necessary to put some other utility, resource, or offensive based aspect in this specific slot. It is more than applicable to do so. Now on our second ring, we have, in a way, our most important aspect, Redirected Force. This allows us to gain increased critical strike damage equal to 70% of our block chance. Blocking doubles this bonus for 10 seconds. So this is what we've been talking about the entire time. And like I said, if you didn't see everything coming together before, this right here should tie everything together for you. Once you basically understand that your block chance will multiplicatively scale your overall critical strike damage, then you basically can understand why we so heavily invested in block chance itself, as well as critical strike damage overall. With all that having been covered, that is going to go ahead and conclude the gear, affix, and aspect section of this video. And so we're going to go ahead and take a quick look into the Spirit Hall section of this guide. When it comes to our primary Spirit Hall benefit, we're going to go ahead and choose the Jaguar. This is going to allow all of our skills to henceforth be Jaguars. This is also going to give us the ability to echo 100% of the damage of our previous 4 hits every 4th hit when we deal direct damage with a Jaguar skill. Like we mentioned before, we don't actually have any source of a skill-based ferocity generator, so our only choice here for our second Spirit Hall bonus is to go ahead and go with Jaguar once again. This is not only going to increase our maximum ferocity by 1, but allow us to gain ferocity whenever we kill an enemy or damage a boss. With those 2 notes, that's going to go ahead and conclude the Spirit Hall bonus section of this guide, and we are going to go ahead and move on to the Paragon section. Before we dive right in, we're not going to really talk a whole lot about the magic or rare nodes because there's not a whole lot going on there, but I do want to basically dive into what is the core components of the Paragon, which will be the glyphs as well as the legendary nodes associated with the boards that we're going to choose, that we are going to be selecting in order to enhance our damage to the fullest possible potential. Getting us started off here on our first board, we're going to go ahead and pick up Fitness. This is going to increase our critical strike damage bucket, as well as give us the ability to gain Vigor whenever we critically strike with a skill. As I've mentioned countless times before, this is a primarily critically strike damage centered build, so this is one of the obvious choices for glyphs. On top of the fact that it will allow us to generate Vigor without using our basic, this is definitely one of the best first choices for glyphs. Moving on to our second board and our first additional legendary board, we have Sapping. Sapping's legendary node reads, when you cast 3 Gorilla, Jaguar, Eagle, or Centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your Vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. This is going to allow us to gain a 30% multiplicative increase on our damage simply by casting our Razor Wings. When it comes to our socketed glyph, we are going to go ahead and pick up Spirit. This is once again going to give us an increase on our critical strike damage bucket. In addition to this, it's going to allow us to gain an overall increase of up to 15% multiplicative damage, stacking by 3s per critical strike. Jumping over to the left and looking at our third board, we have Convergence. Convergence's legendary node reads, you deal bonus damage equal to 20% multiplicative of your 2 highest bonuses to damage types combined, up to an overall accumulative value of 30% multiplicatively. For our socketed glyph, we have Colossal. Colossal is granting us an additional amount of gorilla damage, which isn't too important due to the fact that our specific spec does not utilize it, but most importantly, the additional effect of 2% multiplicative increased damage for each stack of resolve is absolutely massive for our specific build variant. As we know, we are stacking an absurd amount of resolve stacks due to the fact that each individual slot that is available does have maximum resolve stacks tempered onto it. Moving slightly upward here to take a look at our 2 final boards, on the right being Drive and on the left being Infight. Drive's legendary node reads, after moving 10 meters, you deal 3% multiplicative increased damage for 10 seconds, and this can stack up to 10 times, giving a total value of 30% multiplicative damage. I'm not sure if you're seeing a pattern here, but I definitely do. It seems like all of Spiritborn's initial legendary node values are capped at around 30%. We've gone ahead and opted for Talon as our socketed glyph within Drive. This is going to go ahead and grant us additional eagle damage, which is definitely beneficial to our overall Razor Wings damage, but primarily we're looking at that eagle skills damage deal 15% increased critical strike damage, which is absolutely massive when synergized with all the additional critical strike damage multipliers and additional factors that we've already discussed and invested in throughout the video. For our final board, we have Infighter. Infighter's legendary node reads, when you dodge or block an attack, you gain 2% additive increased attack speed, as well as 1% multiplicative increased damage for 5 seconds, stacking up to 9 times. This means that overall you can get 18% additive increased attack speed, as well as 9% multiplicative damage. Now, this benefit isn't the best. However, compared to other options, it's definitely more viable, and due to the fact that the rare and magic nodes are definitely more useful, and the glyph area isn't too bad, I decided to go with this one for my last board. Now, there weren't too many options when it came to socketing my final glyph, so I decided to go ahead and settle on Headhunter. This does give me a multiplicative increase of 10% to all elites. However, the primary benefit that I'm looking for is that overall increase to main stats and rather normal nodes that it's giving me to the entire glyph area surrounding. This does grant a pretty substantial main stat bonus if you do it properly, especially as you scale the glyph going forward. That does round up the Paragon section of this build as well as the overall guide itself, so I want to end off on a few final notes here. Let it be noted that specifically what I've shown you here today is a leveling and starter variant of the build. I do have unique variants and mid to late game variants of the build, as well as very early game variants that showcase how to spec your skill tree from levels 1 to 15 and then 15 to levels 30, and that is specifically all compiled within my max roll planner, which I'll be linking down below in the description. A lot of the core concepts that I discussed within this video, as well as some of the synergies that I've shown, are coherent throughout a lot of the builds that I've made. So if you've learned anything within this video, it should be transferable throughout all the builds that I will showcase in the future. My main purpose is to use this build guide to spread the information that I've learned through theory crafting, not only so that you guys can maybe potentially craft this build yourself, but use the information that I've disclosed within this video to henceforth then progressively enhance and grow your own individual build or spec of, say, this variant or other variants that I might disclose in the future or you might compile yourself. Once again, I'd like to mention that I do not only have this starter variant of the build, but also a unique and in-game variant of the build, to which I would like to make a build guide for you guys so that everybody knows what to do progressively, as each iteration is slightly different. I've gone through and made various different builds and variants of each different spec and variety of combination synergies in order to basically determine what I feel like is the best starter build for me, as well as potential starter builds that others could use in order to enhance their gameplay and aid themselves in progression whilst basically learning and experiencing what is a brand new class and brand new set of builds, as well as challenges for the entire Diablo community. This class is said to be more hardcore and I would say less casual friendly and more casual gated than the other classes and other builds and specs that we've seen in the past for Diablo 4, which is specifically why I've come back to YouTube and decided to start rolling out these guides again, because I feel like as a more veteran player, more experienced player, and more knowledgeable player that can also articulate and transfer that knowledge to an audience, I'm trying to go ahead and kind of bridge that player gap for casuals and hardcores to break down that barrier that is gating the casual community from stepping into the Spiritborn class and not necessarily playing with it, but excelling with it to the same degree and fashion that some of the other hardcore, more veteran players are. And to that degree, I kind of feel like that's essentially kind of always been my goal here on YouTube and with making these guides. So as we go forth here, we have about 3 to 4 days before the entire Vessel of Hatred expansion and Season 6 releases, depending upon the time zone in which you are located. During this period, I am going to be releasing varying guides of different specs and overall play styles, those of which I hope the audience will appreciate and enjoy. Once Season 6 releases, I am planning a potential live stream based on feedback that I receive within the comments and elsewhere. I'm also planning on updating the builds as I progressively learn more through progression within the game. I also plan on recording and releasing various forms of showcase content, such as the Underground City as well as the Citadel, and potential boss fights, as well as other Season 6 related content. With that being said, I want to go ahead and thank you guys for watching. I hope that you go ahead and give this build a try, as I have a high inclination that it is going to perform very, very well, not only during the start leveling process, but also the in-game finalization of your overall progression. I hope that you guys are kind enough to give this video a like, as well as potentially subscribe if you're interested in other build guides and content related to D4 as well as Season 6 Vessel of Hatred. If you need any advice, have any questions, or you'd like to give me some feedback, by all means, drop it down in the comments section. This has been Go to Grand. Thanks for watching. Peace out, boys.